Yes, so here it is, the new Apple Mac Studio, and woof. Apple are saying this is as fast as an RTX 3090 for the 12900K. Yeah, look at that. They're even saying it's more performance than the highest discrete GPU. And how do I know that? Have a look here in the fine print there. Alienware Aurora R13, which I'll be getting in very soon. 12900KF, so it doesn't have the integrated graphics, and RTX 3090. So that's what they're comparing it to here. And by the way, 320 watts for the highest end discrete GPU? No. They use 500 watts. And you can see it right down here on the bottom. Yes, 12900K and RTX 3090. And yesterday, before the event, what did I tell you? The M1 Ultra, two M1 Maxes glued together, stitched together, whatever you want to say, with super fast fabric in between them, doubling the memory bandwidth, doubling the GPU cores to 64 GPU cores, 128 gigabytes of RAM. Yeah, that was really hard to predict, that one. Anyway, now we're going to predict the performance, and I've got a good track record of doing that as well. Now I know the most important thing is, can it game? Will it have AAA games? Will it play Crysis? Well, let me be clear, the hardware would be very awesome at gaming, but yeah, there's no gaming support for Macs, and that's just how it is. If we have a look at the key specifications here, 370 watts, okay? So this bad boy here can use up to 370 watts. That is a tiny amount of power, considering that's the CPU and GPU. As I told you before, a 3090 can actually use over 500 watts, and a 12900K can use 280 watts. Well, that's not typical, but it can use that amount of power. Now let's have a look at the key specs of the M1 Ultra, okay? The important things here is 20 core CPU. Maybe there's a bump in frequency, we don't know. 370 watts tells me maybe there is, because the MacBook Pro 16 only uses 140 watts. And we also get a 64 core GPU. Now the big deal to me is the 800 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth. That's for the CPU and the GPU. That puts it up with the big boys, okay? RTX 3090 does around 930 gigabytes per second. So it's right up there with the proper discrete GPUs for memory bandwidth. But one thing that is mind-blowing is it has 128 gigabytes of unified memory. This is an option, of course. That means the GPU can have 128 gigabytes of memory. Well, not really, probably 126. You got to use some for the system and the CPU, but nothing else comes close to this, okay? There is nothing out there, no discrete GPU that can use 128 gigabytes. Now, what you can do with high-end Nvidia GPUs is you can use NVLink and sort of pull the memory together, so use two GPUs and use the memory of both, but it's nowhere near as efficient as this, being able to access the same memory bandwidth in the M1 Ultra, with Apple using Ultra Fusion to stitch two M1 Maxes together. So Apple are not messing about here with that GPU. It's got the memory bandwidth now, 64 cores now. I would imagine it uses more than 150 watts based on the 370 watt package. And I was just curious, so I ran a benchmark on my RTX 3090 with the 12900K. I ran it at the same settings I run on the M1 Max in my MacBook Pro 16. Now the MacBook Pro 16 with the M1 Max, half the memory bandwidth, remember, and no optimized driver for the game, this is Shadow of the Tomb Raider, gets 93 frames per second. On the RTX 3090 desktop with a 12900K, overclocked mind you, I could get about 220 frames per second at the same settings. So you might think, well, double 93, it's 186. It's still short of an RTX 3090. But again, no optimized driver for the M1 Max. And you got to remember the M1 Ultra has doubled the memory bandwidth. So that would make up the difference. And that, for me, definitely puts in the ballpark this M1 Ultra's GPU with RTX 3090. I don't think Apple are pulling the Swift one there. You usually take Apple benchmarks with a pinch of salt, not a grain of salt. Why do people say that? But anyway, it's probably in the ballpark there, using a lot less power, of course. But when it comes to comparing the CPU, now when we talk about the CPU, it looks like Apple are up to their old tricks here. I think they're using Geekbench, looking at the figures there, from what we know from the M1 Ultra leak in sort of Geekbench scores. Because it does say here it's a 16-core i9 12900K. So let's get into comparing it to the Intel CPU. I will actually make a separate video and I'll do some charts on predicting the performance. And I've been pretty good in the past at predicting this sort of stuff. So, and make sure you do subscribe because I will be getting one of these Mac Studios in. Now, if we have a look at the CPU, all right? This is where I think it's probably fallen a little bit short compared to Intel, even though you see this. I'll tell you why. Now, what I'm about to tell you doesn't mean the Intel CPU is faster. I'm just talking about raw CPU power when you peg the CPU. This doesn't take into account memory bandwidth, which in certain worst case scenarios will make a huge amount of difference for the M1 Ultra. And in those scenarios, it'll blow away the Intel CPU. But those sort of work cases are not typical. If we just look at raw CPU power, and I don't use Geekbench, please. But anyway, here's the single core. The single core will not be any faster. Now, a 12900K does around 2000 single core. Yes, at least 1900. So given that single core performance may only increase a little bit, you can say that the Intel CPU has faster single core speed, which is what we use most of the time. And again, it doesn't include the hardware encoders and all the magic of software optimizations and stuff like that. This is just raw CPU power. So single core, the Intel is still faster. Now, if we go to multi-core and we double the M1 Max, we're looking at about 25,000, just over 25,000. That's its Cinebench multi-core score. Now, a 12900K can do 29,000. So it is falling short on the multi-core as well. So all these people saying, how is Intel feeling? I don't think they're feeling anything. It's sort of not fair to compare the two because Intel makes CPUs. They don't make a sort of all-in-one package like Apple, and yeah. So it is what it is. Can't wait to get one in. Make sure you subscribe. Let me know down there in the comments what you think. But just remember one thing. RTX 4090 will be out this year. It's supposed to have double the GPU performance. So where does that leave Apple then? But of course, you got the Mac Pro, right? It's probably going to be 4 M1 Maxes put together. So imagine that, with an extra 20 CPUs and even maybe beyond that. It's going to be very interesting. Let me know your thoughts on this absolute monster of a, desktop. I cannot wait to get it in. Let me know what you think. But there's one thing, can it play Crysis? Well, probably not. So anyway, catch you in the next one. Tally ho.